Anywhere you like. Well, we're going to pick up on the back of Rick's presentation because now that we're all thoroughly depressed at the way things are, we do want to figure out in this first discussion whether or not our kindergarten to grade 12 education system is up for the challenges of this Pacific century, as it's been labeled. And we want to pick that apart over the next period of time that we have for this. First, we'll debate it up here, and then, of course, we're hoping you'll chime in with questions after we set the table for a bit of this discussion. We want to take a look at what governments are doing, what teachers are doing, what parents and students are doing, and see whether or not we're on the right track and making the kind of progress we need to make so that we don't end up with this doomsday scenario that Rick has put out there. Veronica, get us started here, because you've spent 35 years, at least maybe 40, thinking about these issues. Enough years, anyway, that's for sure. I first met you, I think, when you were Deputy Minister of Education a while ago, or Director of North York's Board. Right, even before that. Are governments, in your view, focusing on the right priorities to ensure that we are in the process of creating the best education system that we will need to meet these challenges? What's your view?
So I'm going to focus a little bit more on Ontario rather than Canada, but I think that this is pervasive. I think that Ontario actually over the last 8-9 years has done an excellent job in 4 areas. One, in the literacy. I think that there has been tremendous improvement in the literacy rates of our youngsters. Secondly, the focus on early childhood education, the full-day kindergarten, the early learning has been very important and a huge improvement as well. In terms of the number of graduates from our secondary schools, again, moving from 67 to 82%, and bridging the gap between the achievers and the non-achievers, which is also the socioeconomic issue that's very, very important for a developed country. I would say that going forward, there are some areas that require assiduous attention.
Like what?
One is math and science, and the whole area of problem solving and critical thinking. The role of technology in schools and in the classroom, we call it the flipped classrooms, but really rethinking what should happen at home and what should happen in the classroom. And I think the nature of the classroom and the dialogue between teaching, the old style teaching and the new should really, that relationship should change dramatically. I would say that another area that has to change dramatically is the articulation between school and the workplace, at the school and PSE, post-secondary education. Innovation in education, I think, has to take place. I think this notion of not having a year-round schooling is just very old-fashioned.
Is it true we still have an education system basically set up around an agrarian calendar?
Absolutely, and that is right across the country. The fact that we don't consider independent studies, for example, deserving of credit, I think that's pretty old-fashioned. We need to rethink all of that. I would say of grave concern to me and to many others is the performance of boys. And particularly if you put the context of boys and boys, African Canadian boys, Ishmaeli boys, Somali boys, Portuguese boys, I think that we have a major challenge that we need to address.
Okay. Sachin, why don't you come in on the back of that? Where is government setting the right priorities for the education system we're going to need to prosper in this century?
Well, I think so. I mean, if you look at Canada's performance compared to, say, other countries internationally, like the OECD does a lot of work on this. I mean, Canada's pretty much top 10 in reading, science, mathematics, and if you look at the countries ahead of us, I mean, that's taking into account a lot of those aren't countries at all. So Hong Kong, Shanghai, city-states like Singapore, and even of those other countries that are ahead of us, you know, they're not as diverse and multicultural as we are. So if you look like Korea and Finland as well. So I think overall we are doing a good job internationally. I mean, that doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels. As Veronica mentioned, one thing I think we need to do a better job at is addressing these big achievement gaps we have. And so, you know, whether it's our Aboriginal students or African Canadian students or just even our low-income students in general, I think there's still a lot of work to do in that area specifically.
I'm told that your postal code determines how good an education you're going to get as much as anything. Is that right?
Well, I mean, there's a certain degree of truth to that. So if you look at, I mean, I had something in the Star a few weeks back about that, the fact that there's this idea of good schools versus bad schools. And the good schools are, you know, no surprise, in the high-income areas, and the quote-unquote bad schools are in the low-income areas. And I mean, that's something that we can't tolerate if we're going to have true public education.
Okay. Chanjar, you come to us from York University. Is the government setting the right priorities for our education system?
Well, it's a bit hard for me to talk about government, but I can talk a bit from a comparative perspective. As far as I can see, my answer to the question is our schooling system up to the 21st century. I think my answer is both yes and no. For yes is, I think Canadian students are doing pretty well. If we use PISA, OECD's PISA as a benchmark, the most recent result, which is 2000 result, Canada was ranked number 6. Pretty good, yeah.
Does everybody know what PISA is? When we talk about PISA scores, everybody gets that?
It's a program, international assessment program, international student assessment. Mm-hmm. It's a test of the problem-solving skills and abilities at the age of 15. So if you look at Canada's performance in the 2009 PISA, Canada was ranked number 6, next only to Finland in the Western world. It's pretty good. If you look at the equity, Canada's doing very well. And by equity, I mean the not much difference between the public and private schools, not much difference between the students from different cultural backgrounds or racial backgrounds or socio-economic status. And also, if you look at the approach to help students, Canada features pretty much the student-centered approach, which is always putting the efforts to empower the students. But that doesn't necessarily mean Canada does not have room to improve. If you compare Canada with China, you will see in terms of the reading dimensions, the Canadian students are doing pretty much the same level as China was ranked the top position in the 2009 PISA results. Canadian students were doing pretty much the same level. But if you look at science and maths, Canadian students, in terms of maths, 73 score points behind the Chinese students. If you look at science, Canadian students are 46 score points behind the Chinese students. Again, we can look at efficiency issues. Just now, I think our keynote mentioned that the grade retention is quite common in Canada nowadays. If we look at the dropout rate, I think it's also pretty high, even though it's improving. Yeah. My data shows from 16.6% in the 1990 to now to current 8.5%. But still remains, such a rate remains unacceptably high. If you look at efficiency in terms using the resources, my figures show in 2010, Canada spent $57 billion to educate 5.03 school students. We can compare that with China. In the same year, China spent $150 billion to educate 200 million students. I guess another point is in 2010, our graduation rate was 78%, as opposed to 84% in China. And in 2010, the same year, our student-teacher ratio was 14, as opposed to around 20 in China. I guess I'll stop here. If I have time, I can come back to illustrate a point by comparing the cultural values and explain why this happened.
I'm tempted to ask, is it easier to have these better numbers when you're running an authoritarian dictatorship? But I'll leave that for another show. Sure. Okay, we've had 3 people now who've basically spent their lives studying education, and now we get Margaret Wente, who hears from real people on this issue and who has no shortage of opinion on whether or not our governments are leading us in the right direction. What do you see out there?
All right, I'll suggest a few different adjectives for our education system. Mediocre, expensive, bureaucratic, inflexible, incredibly resistant to change. It's also a monopoly, which makes innovation and competition extraordinarily difficult. And of course, Usually the way you get innovation is through competition, which we don't have because the government has a monopoly on the whole thing. We have an education system that's really not pegged to the agricultural world so much as it is to the industrial age, where you put the widgets in one end, that's kindergarten and grade 1, and then the teachers, the workers, come along and they do a few things to them, and then they progress to the next stage, which is grade 2, and then they all spit out in 12 years' time. And the product, so we're told by many, many employers and by many, many university professors who get these kids at the other end, is pretty mediocre. At the top, it's great, best in the world, but in the middle, not so great, and the bottom, really, really bad. We still have, and you'll hear this from anyone who works at the university level, we still have basic issues with competency in literacy, although that has gotten better, and especially in math, where some people will argue we've actually been going backwards because of the way that we teach math. And it's not just me saying this. I've talked with the head of OISE who says the same thing. And you talk with math professors all across the country who say we have a huge math deficit in this country. We don't teach it properly. We misteach it. We have a whole education system where teachers don't know how to teach it. And talking about skills deficits, that is one area where we are crying out for more competency, especially in engineering, technical fields. Our kids don't go there, and they don't know how to go there. So we have this really fundamental problem. That's one. The other one, as you correctly pointed out, is the boys' problem, where the gender performance in both schools and the workforce, especially among lower middle class boys and girls, is going like that. It's wildly diverging. The question is, can you get the kind of reform, I think very fundamental reform, new ideas, innovation, new processes, new ways of approaching education, maybe taking us out of the assembly line industrial age towards the 21st century without competition from either inside or outside the system? You cannot. The only way, I think, to get to where we have to go as fast and radically as we need to get there, and using all of the new technologies that we have out there effectively, is to open the thing up to competition from both private and nonprofit groups, and let everybody come up with new ideas.
Can I follow up on that? People in education would say we have a public system, we have a Catholic system, we have a French system, we also have a private system. They would say there's lots of competition out there already. Is that not the case?
Not when you have a big education bureaucracy run by the government with thousands and thousands of people who have a stake in the system and who have a stake in not changing the system. Not when you have teachers' unions which don't believe in merit pay, believe in seniority, don't believe in firing anyone ever, which is built on an old industrial union model that also stifles innovation and change and can't reward excellence.
Okay, hold off on the teacher angle because we're going to get to that. You wanted to follow up.
I want to touch on a couple of things Margaret said. So this idea of kids going off to post-secondary and not having high skills, I know there's a lot of anecdotes around that, but if you look back just sort of in history, professors have been saying this for like 200 years. I was reading, Toronto Star headlines from the early 90s a few days ago, and same thing. Kids don't know math, kids don't know this, kids don't know that. Whether there's actually any empirical data to support that, no one really knows. Now, the second thing I'll say is one of the things that, as I began to study education, that sort of bothered me is I found there's this big sort of ideological divide. So there were sort of left-wing ideas and people who associated with that, so they were sort of against testing and accountability and all that sort of stuff. And then there's sort of right-wing ideas, and that's some of the things Margaret mentioned. So charter schools, more competition, school vouchers. But to me, those aren't the things we should be paying attention to. There's only really two groups in my view. There are things that work and things that don't work. And a lot of the things around school competition, like school vouchers, for example, if you look at the evidence on this, this has worked well in exactly 0 places. So they introduced this in Sweden in the early 90s. You know, the government was influenced by sort of these pro-market ideas, and their performance has actually decreased since then, if you look at their performance on PISA and the OECD. Same thing as charter schools. Look at the US. They have a wide charter school system in many states, and most studies show they're, at best, about as good as public schools. So I mean, if these ideas work, that's great, but we shouldn't be adopting them unless we have actual evidence to support that.
Veronica, would you care to comment on
That,
the
I
point?
think that evidence-based decision-making is exactly where we need to be at. I mean, certainly the United States is in a terrible, terrible situation. And when there is a problem, what they do is that the government withholds funding, or they close the school, or they turn it into a charter school. And as you say, there's no evidence that, in fact, charter schools make a difference. Nevertheless, there are instances where innovative practices have been implemented, not only in our country, but in other countries as well. I'm not sure that in fact, I am not on the same page as Margaret, although I agree with many of the things that she says in terms of our resistance to change and our acceptance of mediocre performance. I'm very much on that. I think that looking at what Finland has done, looking at what Singapore has done, and you can't say that Singapore has a private system or competitive. I mean, there is very, very strong government support for what they're doing. Huge investment in teacher education, huge investment in leadership, principles. I mean, like millions and millions and millions of dollars to build capacity in the system so that there is enough confidence in principles to allow innovation to take place.
Those are both much more homogeneous societies than ours. Does that matter?
Well, I don't know. Singapore, I mean, I think that they're not as homogeneous as we think they are. There are a number of cultures and languages in Singapore. Yeah, so I think, you know, we have this idea that maybe China is homogeneous in Singapore, but they're not. So even though we like to take great comfort in the fact that we're the most diverse society, you know what? There are other countries that are equally diverse and are dealing with very, very challenging issues.
Peggy.
I think we talk way too much about equity, which is very important, but not enough about outcomes, which are even more important. And when the Asians are skunking us in math and science, they are skunking us. And it's not just this little city-state of Singapore, it's Korea, it's Japan, all across Asia you have the same results. You have to say, maybe shouldn't we go and look at what they're doing and how they're doing it?
Sachin?
One thing I want to come back on that, though. If you look at a lot of these Asian education systems, and yeah, they're doing really well in math and science and so on, but if you look at what they're trying to do now, they're actually trying to become more like us in many ways. Because, I mean, although there's high achievement, there's huge problems as well. I mean, stress on students, anxiety levels, depression, even in suicide, right? You have kids, for example, in China who study almost their whole lives for their college entrance exams. I mean, even prior to kindergarten. I mean, and after school they go to cram schools to study. Educators go there talking about how the kids are so tired from studying the night before they can barely stay awake in class. So I mean, is that something we really want to adopt here?
You say no.
Well, what I'm saying is not everything that they're doing is necessarily desirable. There are certain things we can learn from, but it shouldn't be, oh, they're doing so well, let's just copy them.
Okay. Chan, you want in?
Yes, somehow I echo your point. I think a Canadian approach is very equitable and very democratic. It should be something people around the world admire. But on the other hand, I think this kind of approach would benefit mostly the students from the up SES family background, because those students are better prepared, so they can take advantage of such a approach. Here, I just want to give you some other data. If you, again, we go back to the PISA. Canada was ranked at number 6, pretty high. But if you compare the weakest students, Canadian weakest students, I mean the lowest percentile, and you can see Canadian lowest students or weakest students that were doing quite poorly. They were ranked 28th in reading, 25th in maths, and 20th in science. I guess I made a point. Yeah.
Okay. I know John Manley started all this with his numbers that he wanted you to remember. There's only one number in the education sector today that everybody knows, and that number is 115, because that was the number placed on a bill which has really caused great fissures in the education system in Ontario today, and I'd like to get into some discussion here. Veronica, to you first. In your experience, when these massive showdowns happen between the education system, or the teacher unions in particular, and the government of the day, do they really have deep, long-term, adverse consequences on everything? Student achievement, teacher morale, the whole system itself?
Huge.
Huge.
Huge. I can't begin. You know, you started by saying how many years have been in education. Well, I can go back to 1975 and the exodus from the public system of families who could afford to go. Today, there are families who can't afford to go to private schools who are doing that. It is absolutely tragic that in all these years, we haven't been able to come up with a way of resolving our problems like adults without using co-curricular activities as the whipping stick. I mean, it's just, you know, if we are worried about the competition from the private system, the answer is not that difficult. But for sure, the way we negotiate these contractual agreements is antediluvian. It causes huge harm to young teachers who become disillusioned way too early in their careers, causes great tension between teachers and students. It's a matter of confidence and trust between parents and the school system, between the school system and government. I mean, it is so sad for me to have been in education this long and to see what happens every time there is this kind of behavior.
I can see Peggy champing at the bit to get in on this because...
We're at the end of an era and the start of a new one.
What's the era?
Well, the end of an era is the big alliance between teachers' unions and, you know, all big public sector unions and government. This alliance has held firm since the end of the Second World War. It's finished now, but it's going to take a while to invent the next thing. Why is it finished? Because there isn't enough money left in the system, nor will there be, for governments to keep satisfying the demands of unions. The unions have not yet recognized, although I think it's beginning to dawn on some of them, that the path of the past path is not anymore sustainable. Look at what's happened in Ontario. We have pumped a lot of money into public education the last decade, a lot of it for good reason. We now spend $12,000 a year per student on education in Ontario. I think that's the figure. That's an awful lot of money. Do we get value? A lot of parents would say probably no. Across the country, governments are going to be fighting sometimes to the death with teachers' unions because the issues are the same everywhere. The next one coming up is BC, which is going to be very interesting because it's going to have an NDP government fighting with the teachers' union there. What's happening is a shift in public opinion, which is quite fundamental, and that is that for the first time, the unions are losing their support among the broader public. Parents, for the first time, are looking at the situation and they are saying, I support my own kid's teacher, but I no longer support the teachers' unions. This is a ridiculous system. We've got to change it.
Sachin.
I want to come back on that in a sec. So yeah, one thing governments and teacher unions have to realize is that in order to sustain a strong public education system, you have to have strong public support. And I agree that, you know, when the public sees these squabbles between the two parties, I mean, a lot of it just sounds like noise, but the end result is they lose confidence in the public system, and then you see enrollments in private schools or even in the Catholic system as well. But another thing I'll point out is, you know, we talked about OECD and the PISA data. One thing that almost every high-performing country shares is that they do have strong teacher unions. So it's not the case that having strong teacher unions is sort of antithetical to a high-performing system. The question is, you know, what the unions choose to do in their roles, you know. And I think that's, as teachers, that's one thing we have to ask ourselves. Like, do we want to be seen as professionals, or are we going to adopt sort of a rhetoric that, you know, we're oppressed coal miners or something like that? And I think, you know, when you hear the rhetoric from the union sometimes, that's how it comes across.
But can we do this? Can we innovate become less bureaucratic, make the changes we need to make in order to move the school system forward, plus, in an era of $12 billion deficits, save hundreds of millions of dollars by freezing teacher salaries for a couple of years without completely destroying everything you've created so far?
Well, the first thing I'll say about that is, I mean, yes, education systems are slow to change, but so is any large social institution, right? You look at something simple like in healthcare. So, you know, people started realizing if everyone in a hospital started washing their hands, we'd have, you know, enormous better outcomes for patients. I mean, think of how hard it was to get people to wash their hands in hospitals, something as simple as that. And then you'll get an idea of, yeah, if we want this dramatic change in education systems, it's going to take a long time just because it's so large. Now, in terms of improving things, you know, the unions really have to partner with the governments more, I think, as sort of professional organizations than just, you know, being portrayed as a sort of a vested interest. And in terms of saving money, I mean, we talked about, you know, the costs of failure and, you know, kids doing victory laps and that sort of stuff. That's a huge cost, and that has nothing to do with reducing teacher salaries. It has to do with being more effective at addressing the students that aren't succeeding. So I think there's a lot of money to be saved that way. And we tend to focus on, you know, things that are sort of on the front lines like salaries while not focusing on all the money that's wasted behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Qiang, we haven't heard from you yet on this.
Okay, I want to go back to your previous question whether or not an authoritarian government could input more resources into the schooling system. Actually, my data show is opposite. Again, in 2010, Chinese government invested only 77.5% of the the school operating budget. 77.5% of the school operating budget, as opposed to 99.6% in Germany, 97.2% in 99.6% in Finland, 97.2% in Germany, and 96.3% in Russia. And the OECD average is 81%. So you see, the Chinese government was spending less proportionally. But I guess they spend the resources in quite different ways. Two things I want to mention. First is they empower the teachers.
They what, sorry?
Empower the teachers.
Okay.
Yeah. So they spend a lot of money to provide mostly the mandatory, the in-service professional development programs for the teachers. They think it's kind of an efficient way. I can give you an example. Not far away from York, there's a training base set up by Ontario's partner in China, Jiangsu province. You know, they have been sister province for 28 or 29 years. They set up a training base there. They send their teachers from that province to take up the professional development programs here in Ontario. And guess what? They send almost 800 teachers, school teachers, every year. 800 school teachers every year, all financed, supported by provincial finance.
Well, I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about China, but when was the last time thousands of Chinese teachers decided to unilaterally withdraw extracurriculars or go on strike? Does that happen?
I don't recall.
I think we do.
I don't recall. Yeah. Well, let me just make one more point. This is not about the government. It's not about the system. It's about the cultural values. The other thing is maybe the secret. You can say that's the aspirational students. If you remember that documentary, 2 Million Minutes, we had a debate in TVO, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this is also mentioned by producer. The students are very aspirational. They aim high and they take responsibilities for their own academic performance. So I think this is another point I want to make. Okay. One thing I want to add is, since the government has supported such a huge amount of the teacher in-service professional programs, they also put a high demand for the teachers. If you look at this, research shows the teaching quality sequence in North American context can be quite different from the Chinese context. In Chinese context, the teaching quality sequence goes as the clarity, enthusiasm, standards, sensitivity, and patience. Okay, as opposed to in North American context, that goes as sensitivity, enthusiasm, patience, standards, and clarity. I think that shows something.
I'd like to pick up on something Peggy said earlier and see whether or not we can establish any advice going forward on this. Should we pay teachers more? Should we allow for things like merit pay? Should we fire more bad teachers? What do we do about all of these issues in order to encourage more excellence in the system? Veronica, start us off on that.
We should fire bad teachers. Absolutely. There's no question about that. In fact, bad teachers are being fired all the time. Teachers should be well paid. I absolutely believe that.
Are they today?
Yes, they are.
Do they need to be better paid?
I think that I am pro recognizing additional contributions. Absolutely. I believe that teachers who take on additional responsibilities, for example, they should be properly compensated. There is no evidence that I know of that pay for performance has made a difference in the performance of teachers. Nothing that I have seen. In fact, it's oftentimes detrimental. I do want to say something going back, though, Steve, and that is that I don't believe that unions are the deterrent to innovation. I don't. I think that if we look at other sectors and the industrial sector, and I look at the auto manufacturing sector, where in Oshawa, the CAW and Buzz Hargrove worked with senior management and the kind of quality and innovation that I think that you can have unions, as they do in Germany, working with government, where you introduce innovation. So I don't think it's a causal relationship of lack of innovation and the existence of unions. I do believe that autonomy at the school level and at the classroom level are absolutely key, not only to innovation, but for teachers to feel that they can make a difference.
Sachin, pick up on that if you would.
So a couple things. On the issue of teacher pay, teachers in Ontario and in Canada in general are pretty well paid by international standards. But in large part, I think you want to pay teachers really well, because that determines largely who's attracted to the profession. So if you look at it in Ontario, we pay teachers well, and we get our teachers from the top third of graduates. And then you compare that to many US jurisdictions where teacher pay is much, much lower. And their teachers are coming from the bottom third of graduates. So yeah, we could have lower teacher pay, but you kind of get what you pay for. And I don't think we want to sort of go down that line.
What if we did this? What if we said there's going to be a basic salary for everybody who teaches? But if you get good evaluations from, I don't know what, your principal, your students, we'll bump you up. If you do extracurriculars, we'll bump you up. We have all of these incentives in the system to do more and get better outcomes. Would you be for that?
Well, I think there is a big place in incentives, but when you mentioned merit pay, and merit pay is one of those terms which I think have unfortunately become sort of toxic in education circles. And part of the reason for that is, if you ask the general public, would you support paying teachers who do a better job more money? 90% of them say, yes, that's a good idea. The problem is, we actually don't know in education who our good teachers are, because our evaluation systems are weak or almost non-existent. The students know, right? I mean, I did my graduate thesis on teacher evaluation in Ontario, and I looked at administrators across the province, what they thought about it. And teachers in Ontario are evaluated once every 5 years, right? It's done through sort of a single classroom observation by the principal. And there's only 2 rating categories, satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And every single teacher is satisfactory. So we actually don't know who our good teachers are in the system.
Is that useless?
Well, yes. And I think most teachers and administrators would agree. The thing about merit pay, though, is because we don't actually have good evaluation systems, we've then defaulted to test scores. And that's what merit pay is. And that's how it's generally understood, paying teachers based on test scores. Now, I think most people in education would agree that's a bad idea, just because if you look at them, they're quite variable and not really reliable. So you could have a teacher who, under 1 year, they're rated very highly. Same teacher the next year gets a different group of kids, and their scores drop. So we haven't found a way to develop good metrics around test scores. But if we did have better evaluation systems, then yeah, I think we should be paying better teachers more.
Peggy, your view on some of these other ideas?
We don't evaluate them. We don't teach. Here's what I was stunned to learn. We don't teach teachers how to teach. They go to teachers' college. Do you know how much time they spend in teachers' college learning about reading instruction? It is not weeks. It is not months. It's hours. They spend hours learning reading instruction, the most fundamental skill there is. If a kid doesn't learn how to read properly by grade 3, that kid is pretty well sunk. And I'm talking especially boys here. They're not taught that. So if a teacher is teaching reading effectively, she probably has not learned that in Teachers College. She's picked it up on her own somewhere. This is amazing, but it's true. So we've got to look at the way we teach teachers. It's a really fundamental issue. We've also got to look at the way that we coach them and help them improve. If we had a continuous improvement system, the way that the Germans do in German industry, we would be a lot more effective.
Don't we have that? Teachers have PD days every month, don't they?
No, we'd lock a teacher in the room. She goes on and she does her thing for the next 5 years, and nobody knows what's happening in there. That's our system.
What do you think about the idea of merit pay and incentives and pay them more if they do extracurriculars, that kind of thing?
Let's follow the evidence, but I will tell you right now, money, resources is not the problem. Especially not when we have grade 1 and 2 and 3 teachers who can make 90,000 plus for a 9-month year. That's not an issue.
Qiang, would you pay teachers more if they did extracurriculars?
They do, and if their students perform well or better, they do get extra pay or merit pay in China. This is common because in China still kind of prevailing meritocracy culture, so this is commonly accepted.
Should we do that here?
I don't know. The question is whether or not it can be appreciated or allowed. I think it's the cultural difference.
Right.
A difference in cultural values.
Veronica, would it help?
I think that extracurricular activities, yeah. I think that we should take that out of the equation, and we should be looking at a different model. And we shouldn't expect, if it's voluntary, then it should be recognized that way in the pay scale.
Sachin. One thing on extracurriculars, though, I think you really want to be careful. I mean, after the current dispute in Ontario, a lot of people talked about making extracurriculars mandatory and part of teachers' contracts and all that sort of stuff.
And pay them more for it.
Yeah, but I mean, when you think about it, there's been complaints about teachers and unions and all these stipulations and regulations. Do we really want to bring extracurriculars under that as well? I mean, right now you have teachers who are coaching teams doing it, for their passion and their love, right? Do we really want to say, have those regulations? And I think it would take away from some of the enjoyment that even teachers get from those activities.
On the other hand, everybody that I've talked to about this says that extracurriculars are almost as important as the math and science and English and all of that. It is huge in terms of developing a whole student. And yet, it seems like an afterthought or a throwaway. And teachers can withdraw them seemingly with impunity if they want to. So what do you want to do about that?
I mean, it's unfortunate that it's sort of come to that in places like Ontario. But I mean, under regular circumstances, first of all, going back to your question about Bill 115, I think that was a huge mistake on the part of the government, both politically and policy-wise. In terms of what they accomplished, I don't think they got much out of it, and I think it's done great harm.
Saved hundreds of millions of dollars. That's what they wanted.
Yeah, but the unions were offering those same hundreds of millions of dollars in the first place. So I think they could have handled that a lot better. But that being said, under normal circumstances, you do have a wide range of extracurricular activities being provided in schools. And yes, it has been shown to improve student achievement as well. But again, we want to be cautious bringing that into sort of part of the teacher's contract, because I think that can have some adverse consequences as well.
Okay. Qiang?
I just want to make a point. Even though we're not talking about whether or not we should have the extracurricular activities, but as you may know, at least in Toronto, there's kind of a shadowing education community. Do you understand shadowing education? It is kind of, essentially it's kind of extracurricular curriculum programs, all private. And I shame on me, I put my daughter on a couple of such programs, and I did some research about this kind of community in Toronto. And I found mostly run by 3 kinds of people: Chinese, Russian, and Jewish.
And what do you infer from that?
I don't know. I guess there's something in reality, right? When we talk about the possibility, there's something in reality. Many kids go into this kind of shadowing education programs. Essentially, they are extracurricular programs.
Okay, let's cover one more area and then we'll get questions from the floor here, and that is, we've talked about the role of government, we talked about the role of teachers. What responsibility do parents and or students have to make sure that we're ready for this Pacific century when it comes to our education? Veronica.
Well, we all understand it's a joint responsibility. And we also understand that the values, you talked about the values of the family, more important than the socioeconomic environment. So if the parents value education, provide that kind of support, the impact on student performance is profound. Student engagement, finding whatever they're studying relevant, and this is where co-curricular activities are so important, really being engaged, feeling that what they're learning has meaning, is relevant to their lives now and beyond. You cannot, I believe, overestimate the importance of parental values and support, of schooling, and also at home, and sibling support, not just parental. And student engagement, whatever way we can engage students at every level of their schooling, it means that their chances of success are that much greater.
Peggy.
What I have learned, what's impressed me profoundly, is that many, many families of lower socioeconomic status want the same choices that upper middle class families want. They want the same alternatives in school. Many of them want choices that are not available in the public school system. But if you give them a voucher for a private school, and I'm not talking about expensive private schools, I'm talking about private schools that operate sometimes on tuition of only a few $1,000s a year, when they get a chance to look at the alternatives and send their kids someplace that offers something different, maybe a place with more discipline, maybe a place with more spiritual values, maybe an environmental school, they will take that because they care just as much about the choices and available to their kids and the quality of education their kids get as anybody in this room. And they should get it.
I guess private schools won't be able to turn down students they don't want then going forward. Is that right? Would that be part of the deal?
Yes, sure, absolutely. Well, schools operating with vouchers from the public purse, absolutely.
They would have to take everybody.
Yes.
Unlike today where they can cherry pick the best off the top.
Well, nobody's subsidizing it.
Okay. Sachin.
So in terms of what parents and students can do, one thing I think we could learn, say, from some of the Asian countries compared to Western countries is this, in Western countries we tend to have a cognitive mindset of achievement. So if you do well in school, you do well in math, it's because you're smart. If you don't do well, then you must not be smart. Whereas in many Asian countries, it's more of an effort mindset. So if you're doing well in school, it's because you're working hard. And if you're not doing well in school, well, you could do well. You just have to try harder and work harder. And I think that's something culturally we need to bring into sort of the families in the classrooms here. And one other thing, if you look comparing the two, we tend to stress sort of the practical benefits of learning here. So you tell your kid, okay, well, why should I finish high school? Or why should I do well in high school? Oh, so you can get into a good university. Well, why should I get into a good university? So I can get a good job. So it's all about getting the good job in the end. In terms of whether you actually learn anything along the way, that's treated as secondary. And I think that's something we need to change if we don't want to teach kids to just memorize for tests and we want them to actually build the skills that they'll need.
And it's up to parents to inculcate that change?
Well, parents and the broader society. I mean, schools have that role to play, but everyone does.
What's the role of the parent and the student in all of this?
Well, I want to refer you to a very popular article which is about Tyke Mom.
Yeah.
If you remember that, there's a detail in this article. If a student came home with an A- exam paper, the North American parents would say, oh, you're doing so good, or congratulations, while the Asian parents would say, why don't you get an A? Right, so this is kind of the cultural difference, right? I guess the point here in the Confucian value is put emphasis on the perfectibility of the students. Everyone, each and every student, providing you can work hard enough, then you can get a perfect mark. Another thing I want to mention here, but I'm not sure, which is something seems to me kind of controversial. As opposed to the Confucian values, put emphasis on perfectibility of everyone. Some of my friends and colleagues, they mentioned a point. In the Western culture, they believe kind of the innate ability. I'm not sure it's true or not. So in the North American culture or context, it seems the parents, they put more emphasis on the students' self-esteem as opposed to what I mentioned in the Asian cultural context. But I'm not sure about that. At least I don't have any evidence. I'll throw out for some discussion.
Veronica, should we say to hell with their self-esteem and bring home those A's, damn it?
No, I think that self-esteem should be based on achievement. I think that there should be a correlation between, isn't this great? You're terrific. This is what you have achieved. Not just being. And I think that's the role of teachers as well. And say, help youngsters feel that they can achieve. And I very much agree. That hunger to do well, I think, comes not just innately from kids. I think that together we can create an environment where kids are hungry to achieve, are ambitious to do well, not ambitious to just do or do in a mediocre level. That's what concerns me most, and that is our acceptance of mediocrity. That I think is the poison pill.
Okay, thank you for setting the table. We've got a few minutes before we're going to take our first morning break, and let me just see if there are any questions out here. I know you guys have done a great job. Right back there, please. Yes, sir, start us off.
I'm a bit discouraged by what I'm hearing from the panel, because the question of the session is our K-12 education system up to the challenges of the Pacific century? And my conclusion so far has been probably not, because it seems to me that most businesses, most areas of our society have been radically reinvented over the past 50 years. I wrote a book 20 years ago with Jennifer Lewington, which asked the question, if our grandfathers were to return to society today, would they recognize things as they were? And the answer is, in most areas, not. But walk into a school, and they certainly would. There'd be somebody at the front, there'd be 30 students in the thing, maybe a smaller class than they had, but they would know what's going on because it's so totally recognizable. Now we're 20 years past that, yet more businesses have had to work in a totally reinvented environment, and it seems to me that we're still talking about extracurricular activities and teacher pay. So what my answer to the question, based on what I've heard so far, is no, we're not up to the challenges that Rick Miner and others have outlined.
Well, Peggy agrees with you. Anybody up here want to argue with him? Go ahead, Sachin.
So let's take a turn. So again, if you look at sort of the outside appearance of schools and classrooms and the way they're structured, yes, it could look very similar to how they were whenever it was 50 years ago. But if you look at the actual teaching practices, I'd argue that they're quite different. So I mean, even back when I was in high school, I had many classes where we came in, we sat down, the teacher wrote stuff on the blackboard, you copied those things, and you memorized those sheets and spit them back out during test time. Now, if you look at the way teachers are taught and the way they're supposed to do conduct their lessons, it's quite different in terms of differentiated instruction and all these different strategies. And just in terms of transformation of education, I mean, again, people have been calling for the complete overhaul of education systems as far back as you can remember. And we have had some change, but again, we want to make sure that if we are going to make these changes, that they're going to produce a better result than what we currently have. Right? So even say something like technology in the classroom. Like people ask, well, why are kids learning from textbooks? Why don't they learn on iPads and phones and this and that?
They are more and more.
Well, they are more and more, but if you look at the data on this from the OECD, for example, it's actually computer use at home is a much stronger predictor of student achievement than computer use at schools. Huh. And you can see why. I mean, I'd ask the crowd, we talk about tablets and smartphones. How many of you know how to use a tablet or a smartphone? Just put up your hand.
Everybody does, yeah.
Right, pretty much everybody, okay. How many of you learned to use your tablet or smartphone in school?
Nobody, they weren't
Crickets,
around then.
Right?
Yeah.
So all these technologies, I mean, they're going, if we're going to adopt them and incorporate them in schools, because they're so large and such big social institutions, they're always going to lag behind the rest of society.
You needed to ask the follow-up question, which is, how many of you had your teenage kid teach you how to use that thing? Right, few hands go up here. Okay, thanks for that question. Yes, John. Microphone here.
My question in response to that, Sachin, is this, and that it's whether we are capable in the system to adopt the new methods of learning that are becoming prevalent elsewhere. I'll give you an example. I mean, I don't know a lot about education, but I know something about boys. And I know how much they love to spend time on their games. Now, we have one of our members on the council, which is a world leader in training for aviation particularly, so high-end, expensive. And they refer to, based on the last question, chalk and talk. Chalk and talk is antediluvian. Mm-hmm. That is the way things used to be done. What's done in training of pilots now is simulator-based. It's very similar, although a lot more expensive, than the kinds of video games that my son and his friends love to play. Surely there's a way for us to, when we're worrying about boys, figure out how to get their learning patterns into an environment in which they are prepared to spend endless amounts of time and effort in order to achieve the learning outcomes that we want to try to achieve. And is our system built for that kind of innovation and adaptation?
Well, I mean, I think this is being tried in schools on a small basis, and I'm all in favor for things like experiential learning, so learning through doing as opposed to just being told. But this issue of gamification, I guess I'm still a bit skeptical about it, just for a couple of reasons. So there are actually quite a few companies out there who are creating sort of these educational software and games for kids to play. The problem is, as you just mentioned, like they're not going to be able to compete with Halo 4 and Gears of War and all these games that our kids are actually spending their time voluntarily playing. So I think it's very difficult to get that level of engagement in a video game. And these companies spend tens of millions of dollars developing these games. It's quite difficult to get that engagement while ensuring that there's some level of learning occurring as well.
Veronica?
I like to just not think about technology in the classroom as the computers. I like to think about this as different ways of learning, of accessing knowledge that's out there, of bringing in university professors in physics into the classroom, visiting a museum into the classroom, not just having computers in the classroom. So think of it differently. Secondly, Alberta has lots of data that shows that boys perform better when they're using technology in the classroom. So there is evidence about that. To Graham's point, I think we have to look at Ontario over the last 8 years to see that, in fact, the system is changing, is improving. The McKinsey report is very clear that Ontario is one of the 5 highest performing systems in the developed world. So I don't want to leave it on the note that all is bad.
Should we separate the genders when we educate them?
I think for some things it works, and I don't think that there is a strategy that works for everybody. So the whole point of education is to be able to individualize learning. Technology can't do that. One teacher in one classroom, the way that we're doing it, cannot. But yes, absolutely. In grade 11, math and science, separate them. In history, bring them together. So it's not
one size fits all.
No.
Peggy.
What we need is far more diversity, far more flexibility,
Absolutely.
And far more choice
Absolutely.
in the system. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do that with a centralized, top-down bureaucracy, which is what we have now. It's almost impossible to drive change down that way, and it's not going to work. What you have to do is allow a lot of experimentation at the grassroots by people who are empowered and excited to be educators, and try a lot of different stuff, and try and exploit all of the possibilities of the new technology, which I think are tremendously, tremendously exciting and suggestive, and have boys' schools and have girls' schools and have mixed schools. Just do a lot, much more experimentation and much more diversity than we currently have.
Sachin.
So Ben Levin, who's this professor I work for at OIC, he's written a lot about this innovation in education. And he actually argues that what we have is too much innovation in education. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the educational research, we actually know a lot about what it would take to improve student performance. The problem is implementing those things. That's the hard part. So, everyone is attracted, and rightfully so, attracted to sort of new ideas, sexy ideas, that sort of thing. Where the real improvement is going to come is implementing this across schools. So one thing, for example, one of the biggest predictors of student performance is actually the quality of the teacher-student relationship, right? And that's not something you can buy. You can't just buy iPads and create that. I mean, that's something that takes hard work on the part of teachers and principals and the whole system. And if we could even just improve the quality of teacher-student relationships, you would see a much greater impact on students' performance than things like technology.
Yes, sir, right here. Microphone over here.
Thanks. So just quickly, first a tip for you, Steve. December 3rd, the next round of PISA will come out, and you may want to just rebook the panel for your show, because not only will it update all the data that you've talked about, but its focus will be on math. And I'm not going to predict who will have the upper hand in the panel if you rebook it for December 3rd, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how it's evolving. Another just quick comment about boys. It's not really the main thing I wanted to say, but it's important to remember that more boys are graduating, or the proportion of boys graduating from high school is higher than ever before. And the proportion of boys going to university and graduating from university is higher than ever before. What's happening is that girls are increasing their success at an even faster rate. And connected to what Rick was saying in terms of the jobs that will be needed, it's girls who are not filling those jobs right now, right, in terms of the tech industries and the science industries. So there are gaps in terms of reading scores, boys, girls. But there's a danger that we'll kind of focus on one problem and miss the other. The real thing I wanted to talk about competition in bureaucracy in 2 points. One's just a kind of commercial message, but I'm not going to pronounce on whether Margaret Wente's right in terms of capturing the bureaucratic mentality, but keep in mind that at least in Canada, we have competition among bureaucracies, because we don't have one education bureaucracy in Canada. We have 13. We have one in each province and territories, and that's a tremendous opportunity for competition and innovation that we have that most countries don't have. But my closing comment is just that especially if you focus on the last thing that Margaret Wente said, there is a political contradiction here that makes reform very difficult. Because I think Margaret Wente, she's right in capturing the public mood. There's a certain dissatisfaction, a worry that teachers and their unions maybe are not, they're not innovating enough, they're an obstacle to change. And yet, as she just said, the main thing we need is to empower, right? Empower creative teachers, empower creative education leaders. So from the political point of view, if you want to reform the system, you have to get the people to trust precisely the educators that right now there's a certain skepticism that they're too rigid, that they're too bureaucratic. So the question is how to get politically around that tension. So an education minister can say, trust my teachers, trust my education leaders, to actually implement the reforms. And that's a political challenge when you've got a public mood that's skeptical about the system.
Okay. Paikin, you want a word on that, or?
Well, I have this sort of idealistic model in my mind of small groups of empowered teachers and brilliant principals, dedicated principals, working together to set up the kinds of schools they think will work, with lots of parent-teacher engagement, operating quite autonomously in a world where they're only accountable in the end for results. That's it. And they're basically left alone to deliver or not.
Sachin, last word?
Something I'll touch on that. If you actually look at teachers in the classroom right now, I'd argue they have quite a considerable amount of autonomy. Like I just mentioned, they're evaluated once every 5 years. And by and large, no one's necessarily looking over their shoulder in terms of what they're doing in the classroom. What I think we need to do is, again, if we're going to be we want to be taken seriously as a profession, is make sure actually all teachers are implementing these practices that I just talked about that we know will increase student achievement.
Okay. Part of my job this morning is to keep you on time, and that's our time. I know you want to join me in thanking these four for a great discussion this morning. Thank you.
And with that, we'll take a 15-minute biological break, and we'll be back with the next panel. Thank you very much.